death. Everyone says when they're giving a reading, because it's such a terrifying thing if you get the death card, and I wouldn't advise any tarot reader to say, you know, death is about death. But I think it is. You know, they only say it's about transformation, it's about changing your life. No, it's about death. So when I came to death, I thought, yes, it's going to be about death. It's not going to be about anything else. And so that section, it was particularly sort of, not difficult to write, but harrowing to write and quite disturbing to write, because it was looking at a particular event, and a particularly sort of terrifying event. Yes, where death really did sort of appear almost tangibly. I think the autobiographical always intrudes and enriches, hopefully, any fiction that we write. I think the only place that autobiography doesn't really happen is in autobiography. Because of course in autobiography you're kind of making it up. Whether or not it's true or not, it doesn't matter. You're having to tell a story, so you're having to change things around. Actually, about Havana, I wrote before I was a writer properly, but I went there because I had friends there, and I was staying with gay friends there, and I wrote a piece for Gay Times about the gay scene in Cuba. I would actually call it a gay community. Actually, it's the only time I've ever really seen a gay community, because they actually did have to look after each other. It wasn't just about going out to clubs, it was about who had water, who had a telephone, who had this, who had that. So it was a bit like in any third world country, you rely on an extended family. So I really did feel there was something going on that was slightly more interesting than the West. Nemo Carvajal. Nemo is in some ways he's closer to the madness of Philip K. Dick, because he actually believes in it. Larry is always doubting, but Nemo kind of does believe and becomes a Posadist, which was a real movement, a Trotskyist movement that believed that we should get in touch with UFOs because, logically speaking, they would be from an advanced civilization, therefore they must be socialists. Mary Lou Gunderson is it's kind of based on Lee Brackett, who was one of the few kind of trailblazing women science fiction writers at the time. Interestingly enough, she wrote the script for The Empire Strikes Back. That's why The Empire Strikes Back is such a good script, because it was written by somebody that really understood the kind of fantasy element of science fiction. In some ways, Zagorski kind of belongs in the golden age as well. I needed someone that had been in the golden age of science fiction, which kind of is the late 30s, early 40s. I wanted him to go through the war as well, and he's a sort of anti-Vonnegut character. At one point I thought maybe he's going to be the person that was bombing Vonnegut, because you know, Vonnegut's whole sort of persona comes out of the fact that he witnessed that extraordinary event. So I also wanted him to see the Foo Fighters, which were these sort of strange lights in the sky that were a precursor to UFOs. I think in the future, when people want to find out about the 20th century, science fiction will be an essential component of that, because the way people wrote, particularly in the mid-century, was, you know, one prefers the term, obviously, speculative fiction. It was precisely that, but that's what fiction should be. And in some ways, that's what fiction has lost in this sort of notion of a literary fiction, of what literary fiction is supposed to be, particularly in the west coast of America in the late 30s and early 40s. There was a lot of interest in utopian and dystopian ideas and the balance between them, and actually a kind of pulp engagement with quantum mechanics that is very clumsy and very it's not reading it now, it's very interesting, very freighted with the old, it's golden age science fiction, but they're constantly interested in the idea of the possibility of futures, the futures going either way, and famously the Jack Williamson book story that comes out in Astounding magazine in 1938 called The Legion of Time, where he posits there's people come from the future, there's a bad vamp and there's a good woman, and they're fighting over this one man, because you can either go to the dystopian city or you can go to the utopian city that's called John Bar, and actually that that's coined a phrase called the John Bar hinge, or the John Bar point, I call it. And that moment where history can go either way. There's these points in time, and I think the 20th century is full of them, and 1941 is full of them. For my last book, The Devil's Paintbrush, I had this mad idea of that Ian Fleming and Aleister Crowley had been involved in a British intelligence plot using occult intelligence to lure Rudolf Hess to Scotland. It just seemed such a ridiculous story. I had this strange idea of post-war American sort of spirituality that came out of a kind of the appearance of flying saucers in the mid-century, and sort of strange sort of Cold War world, which affects every kind of American spirituality. I don't think there's a single sort of American religion post-war that doesn't have a kind of science fiction element to it. Also, bizarrely, I remembered from reading this book, Swastika Night, by Catherine Burdekin, that bizarrely on page 87, wherever it was, a character called Hess does leave the inner circle of the Nazis and goes to Scotland. And this was written in 1937. So this strange idea of prophecy. And I suppose the other overarching theme was the idea, the very 20th century idea of dystopia and utopia. I kind of created my own tarot deck in a way for the House of Rumour. It was largely based on Crowley's Thoth deck, because in a sense that's where we start. He in 1941, that's what he was engaged on, and that was sort of his last great work, really, or what he would say part of his great work. I didn't use all of. I used some of his. He, for example, changed his temperance to art, and I used that. He changes strength to lust, which I think is a really good improvement. But I kept things like the female pope. I think the female pope is so much more interesting than the priestess or the high priestess. So I did play around a little bit myself. Having this strange pack of cards was actually quite useful, because it did provide a structure, and I often would just look at them and look at how they sort of pan out. But it's Niels Bohr apparently used to keep a horseshoe in his laboratory, and his colleagues would say, "But Niels, you're a scientist. Why have you got that? Why have you got the horseshoe?" He says, "Well, I've heard that you don't have to believe in it for it to work," and which I sort of believe in as well. You know and I think that one of the characters in the book at one point says that they didn't necessarily believe in magic, but they were interested in the Western esoteric tradition, and of course that's where the tarot sort of fits in. It's seeing this as part of culture. It's seeing it as not necessarily a part of mysticism, and it's and I think that obviously science fiction fits into that. And of course, at that point in 1941, where we see all these people meet, the figure of Jack Parsons is very important. Who's the charismatic kind of amateur rocket scientist in Pasadena who sort of becomes Aleister Crowley's protege, and has this sort of strange sort of trajectory, and this very doomed sense, because I think he did, his kind of career bizarrely shadows John Dee so closely. John Dee who's this brilliant Renaissance mathematician, has this charlatan Kelly turning up and stealing everything off him, including his wife. Parsons, who's this not necessarily a trained scientist, but a brilliant rocketeer and brilliant mind, has this charlatan and L. Roy Hubbard come and steal everything off them, and it's because they both did want to find something out of magic that you can't find. They really wanted to cast a spell, and it's not going to work. What's going to happen is that you mess with something very badly.